what does it take to be a DM? This is a question I've been getting asked a lot lately, and it's one that I find myself struggling to answer. More specifically, most people ask me, or the people that know me ask me this, because I've been a dungeon master for multiple game types for the last 13 to 14 years of my life. Some of them take me as a form of inspiration and or as a role model when it comes to being a dungeon master, and some disown me for their own right. I'm not gonna force anyone to play in my style, I'm not gonna force anyone to do the certain things I do in games, and we all have our different expectations and our different experiences. I think the best thing we should try to do, first and foremost, is to go through the basics. The things that I've learned throughout my years, and the things that I get asked quite a lot. First thing, do you need to know how to roleplay? Yes and no. What do I mean by this? No player that knows they have just started off is expecting you to have a certain voice or have the kind of like voice acting skill of a bona fide god. First and foremost, like, get that out of your head. No player is gonna sit down and be like, oh, you're not member, sir, fuck off. No. There are gonna be some players like that, and I will kind of like go into that topic later on, but no decent human being is going to like shit on you because you don't know how to roleplay when you're just starting off. Get that out of the way. Another thing that I believe that you should also keep in mind that there are multiple styles of DMing, and what I mean by this is that, example, I tend to use a lot of homebrew content, a topic I'll also be delving into, and I also tend to kind of be a bit more energetic, a bit more aspecting on the dark side-ish of role-playing. The idea of choices will have a larger impact on the game, and everything in between. With that being said, you don't have to be like this. You don't have to be like, oh, Jerry's a anime fan and he makes all the fight look like cool combat encounters. That's not something you need to focus yourself on doing. Let me just quickly clarify this. You can be any kind of dungeon master you want to be. Do not aim to be, example, like myself, or do not aim to be like that person, and when you find yourself struggling to be that kind of dungeon master, do not do it. Straight out the bat. With that being said, throughout my years I have seen a lot of players become dungeon masters, and I kind of pick up on like a few subsections of them. I'm gonna be mentioning what each one which I've labeled myself, and the perks, or rather the pros and cons of each. First and foremost, you have the Strategist. The Strategist typically is either somebody that's played Warhammer in the past or tends to have a large aspect of not using theater of the mind. This basically means that he is going to make large battle maps, he is going to use miniatures, even if they're improvised. This essentially is the idea of improvisation, example, making towers out of Pringle cans or putting up terrain as just random pieces of trash. This is something that most people do when they're starting off, because, let's be honest, miniatures aren't cheap, and we all know it. Like, looking at Games Workshop, and especially if you live where I live, where the postage is almost 3 times the amount of the product, yeah, that's a fucking joke. So, yeah. The pros of the Strategist is that if you're a new player and you kind of want to be a bit more hands-on, it's a very good way to be like, okay, I move my character 30 feet, oh, each square is 5 feet, okay. And you kind of have this aspect of, not realism, but you have that perception. You are able to physically see how far you can move, you're able to see, example, if you made a makeshift area that is meant to be a tavern and there are 3 people you can talk to, you know that there are actually 3 people, rather than having to rely on your imagination. The pros of this is it allows you to see it, and it allows you to also interact with it. The downside of it is that, let's be honest with ourselves, setting something like that up, you also need to keep into consideration that it's going to take time. So if you're going to have like a game which is in a public section or in a public scenario, example for me, I used to play in a game shop for 4 years of my life. I used to set things up, I used to go there around 30 to 45 minutes early, set everything up so that my players will have that experience if I knew we were going to have combat. Why specifically for combat? It's great for combat because you have spells which have different ranges, and this in return will allow you to have, well, a lot of fun, like, oh, I cast Firebolt. Okay, you have 60 feet. Can you hit them in 60 feet? And you see them physically looking at the map, measuring it out, counting the squares. And it also allows you to not be like, I guess you're in range. That is something I struggle with even till today, even after 40, if I don't use maps specifically. But even then, I don't find myself to rely heavily on the strategist. I like to rely heavily on theater of the mind. The second dungeon master that most of you probably have seen is the anime DM. We all know that one person that's really into anime and that really shows in his game style. And what I mean by this is not like big titty women or stuff like that. I physically mean that, example, the enemies that he portrays, the way he describes them, and even the attacks, the blows and stuff like that. You can sense that it comes from an area and or aspect that is heavily inspired from certain shows and or anime. As I'll use an example. I had a particular dungeon master who was really into the Berserk anime, and there's nothing wrong with Berserk. I'm a large fan of Berserk, don't get me wrong, but it showed. Like he went a bit over gory, he went a bit over the top, and this is not me saying, oh, we need to censor D&D, or having a bit of over dramaticism when it comes to damage, piercing, dismembering and stuff like that. That's completely fine, but the way you do it shows heavily where you're getting the inspiration from. For example, when I do it, I am a humongous horror fan, so I tend to go a bit more on the aspect of quick but nasty. Alright? So yeah, they're a bit like that, and even perhaps in the voices they use, they may be a bit more high-pitched, a bit more erotic. And another example is one that constantly wanted to fuck the NPCs, and one that wanted to fuck the players. If you're like this, please consider some of your players will not like this. Please stop. Stop. Get some help. The third one on my list is the Edgelord. The Edgelord DM is the kind of dungeon master that really may rely on the source books and or the pre-made campaigns, which I'll also delve into. Although he may use like pre-made campaigns or even as homebrew worlds, he tends to be a bit of a sadist. What do I mean by this? Well, oh god, where do I even begin? Some of you may know about Tomb of Annihilation. Unfortunately, I played with a dungeon master that was a complete edgelord, and what I mean by this is not because he wore black and he was like constantly listening to My Chemical Romance in any way, shape or form, but more specifically, the amount of enemies he'd spew out at us. Like, I ended up buying the book myself, going through it to see if this was actually reasonable. Like, was he making this shit up? Were we meant to fight that many enemies? Were we meant to do all of this? And I found myself realizing, no, he was just an asshole. One aspect of this particular kind of DM which I saw a lot was that he would be very disappointed when we somehow survive an encounter, which isn't something a DM should do. Again, this could just be on the line of him being a complete jackass, which is understandable in and of itself. Like, everyone has their kind of DM style. But if you are DMing and you want your players to fail and or die, I'm sorry, you don't deserve to be a dungeon master. You are there to basically create a narrative for your players. You are there to kind of guide them through a story. If you're constantly just bombarding them each and every other turn with enemies, I personally would not sit at your table. This could just be for me, but The pros of this particular one, if you are a large horror fan or something like that, and you kind of like the idea of dungeon crawling in games, this is a very good style for you. This is perfectly fine. I am not gonna stop you in any way, shape or form. And even I do sometimes enjoy this, like going through a dungeon, going through different mobs, going through different rooms, and you have that aspect of different enemies. But if there are enemies just for the sake of enemies, it ruins the point of combat. One of the last game masters I found was that of the Broken Master. The Broken Master, hands down, is possibly one that I find a lot of beginner dungeon masters are. These are the kind of people that are like, you know what, yeah, I know the basics of the game, but I really want to fuck with the rules, I really want to fuck with the settings, and he will create homebrew content. What is homebrew content? Homebrew content is essentially certain house rules, certain house-made items that are typically made by him, and this could be fun if you add lore to your world, if you're using your own world especially. It's like a really good tool. But a lot of the time what occurs is that these beginner players, or not beginner players, but rather these wannabe dungeon masters, will create items that are completely busted. These are things which you can find on r/Undertale Arcana. A lot of people put their stuff up there and they end up getting tweaked before they are put out for publishing and stuff like that. But something that most dungeon masters don't do is they just put it in a game, play test it, and then they're like, oh, I've made a horrible mistake. And then they don't go back to just fix it. And I'm not saying that homebrew and or homebrew rules are a bad thing, but you need to make a distinction between a barbarian that is able to maybe kill 2 to 3 enemies when he's level 12, and a warlock that can pray to his fucking bone daddy and wipe out an entire battlefield with one spell. Like, yes, you are a caster, but if you are not gonna have repercussions and or spell slots and just out of nowhere pray to your deity and had literally Christ smite down upon you, yeah, that is the point of being the broken aspect, the broken master. Just because you use homebrew doesn't mean that everything is going to be broken. Like, if you want to be like, but I want to make a sword that has like a soul inside it, or oh, I want a soul will give my players information when they get close to a graveyard. By all means. The good thing about Dungeons & Dragons is that it allows you to create this. There are endless possibilities. This is your game at the end of the day. Just keep in mind that if you make something that is broken, you can go back and just be like, hey, I made a mistake, we need to tweak that item. If your player can't accept that, okay, throw a fucking rust monster at him and eat all the magical shit away. Again, this is your world. This is your invention. If you made something that is way too overpowered, please tweak it. Do not have the entire game revolve around you having to make mobs stronger, making encounters even more difficult, just cause of this one item. This will make the game extremely unfun, and it will make everyone dislike it except for the one person that has that one item. I am saying this from my own experience, because as I mentioned, I am in my starting years, because I don't rely on the source material that much except for classes, races and stuff like that. The reason for this is that I kind of like making my own world, and there's nothing wrong with that. I love making my own monsters, I love making my own things, and for some of you that may know me, I actually do release some of my own work over on Dungeon Masters Guild. And this includes races, this includes player raids, and even stuff which aren't applicable and or found within the source materials. Lately I have released a player's menu, which allows for players when they go into a tavern to actually be served the menu. They can flip through it, they can find items, and then the Dungeon Master gives them the prices. This has been something that I've kind of made on the fly as a joke, and then people are like, oh, can I have a copy of it? Oh, can you actually make this a bit more? Oh, and I realized it was a market that I could hit. So I will leave a link to that in the description. If you guys want it. The last kind of Dungeon Master which I've seen in the past is the Clueless Player. This kind of falls into the bracket of all of the ones that I've mentioned before, because if you don't have experience with the game, and I don't mean, oh, I've never played D&D, but I really like the aspect of the Dungeon Master, but do I have to play first before I can become a Dungeon Master? Preferably, yes. What do I mean by this? If you're going to straight up be like, okay, I'm gonna buy the Dungeon Master's Guide and the Monster Manual and the Player's Handbook, and I'm gonna read through all of them, and I'm gonna be fucking great. Stop. First and foremost, just because you've watched hundreds of hours of Critical Role, High Rollers, Dancing with Dragons, that does not make you proficient at the game. That does not make you good at the game. That does not make you a bona fide god and or Matt Mercer level. Do not aim to be Matt, which has actually been coined ironically as the Matt Mercer effect. If your players are like, oh, but Matt Mercer does it like this, oh, but Matt Mercer does it like that, you are not a paid professional. I am repeating this for the last time. Okay. Keep in mind that in my case, I've been playing for years. So I kind of know and have the experience of being like, okay, you have this encounter, that gives you this reward. Yes, you will find loot tables inside of the Dungeon Master's Guide, But a lot of the time, players will find kind of struggle, especially if they're newcomers, to give out certain loot, because they're just like scratching their head like, fuck, what should I give them? Should I give them this? Is this a bit too much? Is this a bit too little? For those specific players, if you're somehow watching this and you kind of feel like this is addressing you, first and foremost, be humble. Do not be like, I am the god of dungeon mastering, bow to me and suck me up. No. Do not be like, I am the god of dungeon mastering, bow to me and suck me up. No. Don't be like that. Because if you're gonna talk a big game, you're gonna have a bigger fall. Don't be afraid to give out too much items as long as they're not too overpowered. Example, if they are somehow find a sword of +1, that's completely fine. Don't be like kind of restrictive when it comes to those items, especially when they level up. But also keep in consideration, if you give out way too many magical items, it's going to break the game. Pros and cons of being the clueless player. A lot of the time, like I started off as the clueless player, I started off 100% not even reading the source material because I was too fucking broke to buy the books. I repeat, I was too broke to buy the books for a game I love. And a lot of the time it would be based off of what I've seen when I played. And this is like this. Keep in mind, when I started, the books weren't very publicly based. And what I mean by this is they weren't online. Like if you Google right now, Player's Handbook, you'll probably find D&D Beyond with some aspects of it which are free. Back then, it wasn't really as popular as it was now, so there weren't a lot of online sources for it, unfortunately. But I digress. Those are some kinds of dungeon masters which I've seen. They all have their perks and they all have their cons. This is going to bring me to my final point. What do I mean by this? As I mentioned throughout, I have a large love for homebrew myself, and with that being said, a lot of the campaigns that I've run in the past are homebrew. With that being said, a lot of people like to rely on the source books for their games. They like to rely on certain scenarios, and they like to rely specifically on pre-made worlds by Wizards of the Coast. There's nothing wrong with that. Like, hands down, I have run a few of the modules myself at public events for like certain game groups and stuff like that. But do not let them limit you. The rules are a guideline. I know this kind of sounds weird considering that a lot of the time people are like, oh, shouldn't you like follow the rules of the game to have fun? Yes and no. Let's take for example Curse of Strahd. Curse of Strahd is a very good beginner quest line. Like, I generally recommend it if you're starting off on D&D. Either start with two best ones that I recommend just for the simple sake. They're really, really roleplay oriented. You don't have a lot of combat and it's just genuinely a really, really fun time. But sometimes, and this is gonna happen to every dungeon master, even myself, players are like, this is the main storyline. They then proceed to go to the equivalent of Antarctica. Why? This is just the thing players do. Don't always rely on the books. You will have to be able to make stuff up on the fly. You can be like, hey guys, the quest is over there, and you kind of like push them towards it, but don't railroad them. Level up to level 3 kind of explains this a lot in his skit about railroading. Do not be that kind of dungeon master where even if you your players are trying to do anything else, you are forcing them to do something. Please do not do this. This is not fun. Like, your girls, you are forcing them to do something. Please do not do this. This is not fun. Like, you're like, yes, I'm progressing the story, but your players are there like, are we playing the game or are we just hearing you essentially stroke your ego? Like, please don't be that guy. 100% please don't be that guy. And I think that's a very good point to kind of talk about what you should expect from players as a dungeon master. This is a question I surprisingly get a lot of, and it's not easy to explain, so please do bear with me. Some players will have different expectations from the games that you're going to give them. Do not expect all the players to have fun straight off the bat. Do not expect them to be like all giddy and happy with their games. This is normal, this is fine, and this is me actually being serious here. I'm not trying to play this up for laughs. This is fine. I have gone into games where at the end of the game I sit down and depressed, and the reason for that can vary. It could be because the game itself didn't meet their expectations, and that's completely fine. Sometimes players will struggle to find their character. You cannot expect your players to be bona fide players that you've seen in other games. They still need to connect with their characters, they still need to understand who their character is, even if they were the ones to have made it. And it's peculiar. I know, it's very peculiar, and it's something that does take a lot of time to do. Hands down. And when it happens, I find myself struggling and asking myself, did I not do a good job? Did I not enjoy it? Did I fuck up? The best thing you can do in this situation, believe it or not, ask. Literally at the end of the game, when you're packing, turn to your players and ask them, hey guys, did you guys have a fun time? Do you want another session next week? Or whenever you guys have like monthly games or 2 weeks, up to you. A lot of the time, yeah, they had a fun time, including those particular players which seem to be a bit down. The reason for that is that they're still reflecting on their character. Just because they're down and or they're brooding doesn't mean that they didn't have fun. A counter argument could be made like,
oh, they're just saying that to protect my feelings, you know, like, as I've had players do.
Okay, if you have had players do that to you, tough shit. Those players are probably fucking jerks. Most of the time, players will be like, yeah, I had a fun time, but a lot of the time they're also gonna be like, between games, they're going to be texting you like, hey, I kind of didn't really feel like I connected with my character, or hey, the way you're dungeon mastering is kind of leaving me feel like I'm being left out. Those points can be valid, and those points can be selfish. Take everything your players say with a pinch of salt between games, but also keep in mind, example with a pinch of salt between games, but also keep in mind, example for new time players as well, you will find them be in a very specific bracket. Some of them will be really good at role-playing, they're really good at putting themselves out there, and there are those that are still starting, which are very, very shy, and are like, even when it comes to combat where everyone has a turn, they will struggle to pick their spell, they will struggle to attack, they will struggle to project themselves as their character, because they don't know how to yet. This, I repeat, is normal. I love how I'm now talking about the player aspect more than the dungeon master aspect, but please, when you are DMing, you aren't just a story narrator, although I have hammered this point. You are there to observe them. You are there to observe their body language. You are there to observe that they are in themselves trying to get into the game. Sometimes a player may think they're into D&D when they're really not, and they will move away from the campaign or they'll stop coming to sessions. Somebody that had way too many groups flake on me, I know this firsthand, and it's fine. Do not pressure yourself into being like, oh, my players left me and therefore I feel like shit. If you are worried that a particular player is having a very bad time, please pause the game, or even like, hey guys, let's take a break, I need to take a piss or something, and then pull the player to the side, ask them, hey, are you okay? Hey, are you that? Just because you're playing a game doesn't mean that your player's health and or if their situation at home isn't great. D&D can be an escape, but it can also be a prison, especially if you have certain demons in your head along with the ones on the table. Please do keep that in mind as a dungeon master. I am not saying this as a certified professional, I am in no way a therapist and or psychiatrist, but a kind word and a question like that goes a long way. And on that note, I genuinely hope that you guys enjoyed this. I might make another video focusing on other subjects if you guys like this form of content. This is my first attempt at this form of content, so I do genuinely hope you enjoy it. Take care, everyone.